I'm going to break one of the cardinal rules that was bequeathed to me by my homiletics professor at Emmanuel College in Toronto. Paul Scott Wilson offered the rule, don't talk about the process by which you prepared your sermon because it simply takes away from the impact of the proclamation. Well, I think it's important to share a couple of the things that were important in my prep for today. First, when I approach a text with drama in them, such as the first and gospel readings for today, it's often useful for me to ask myself, and perhaps many of you have done the same, who am I in this story? Or with whom do I identify in this story? The second principle I have followed is one that I think is useful for all of us for engaging in with the Bible in general. Because I'm not of the persuasion that a given story within Scripture has to have only one meaning, and that if we have the Spirit, or do the right exegetical study, or meditate upon it for enough days and enough nights, that this meaning will become evident to us. It seems to me that as we re-encounter the stories of the Scriptures again and again, we uncover yet another layer of meaning with each new reading as we reconsider the things that we've already learnt and as we consider our life situations. So you can probably tell that I'm going to be concentrating mainly on the first reading and the gospel today. And in the first reading, I identify with Michal, or as was rendered in the paraphrases today, Michelle. And I see myself as perhaps one of her advisors or one of her courtiers. And I'm left with a question. Why was Michal so disgusted with David and the dance that he performed when bringing the sacred ark into Jerusalem? Why was Michal so up and mad? Was it because she saw David's dance as acting in an undignified, unroyal way? Was it because she thought David was improperly dressed? The linen ephod in which the text said David was dressed, at least from the artistic representations that I've seen of it, was a priestly garment not much bigger than an apron. It may or may not have been supported by a belt or shoulder straps, and it may or may not have covered both the person's front and back. Was it because she remembered the fact that David's investiture as king came at the expense of her father, Saul, and she couldn't let go of that resentment? Was it because she thought that she could see through all of the ecstatic displays and the ceremony and the generosity shown by David at the end of the ceremony, all the goodies that everyone got to take home, and she viewed this as just a calculated attempt on her conniving husband's part to consolidate his position as king? Well, if you read on in the 6th chapter of the 2nd book of Samuel, the writer tends to lean toward the lack of modesty or lack of dignity explanation, and this leads to a household spat between David and Michal, after which the text says, Michal had no more children to the day of her death. And there are more questions which enter my mind. Was this divine judgment? Was this a calculated move on David's part to make sure there were no more descendants of Saul to challenge him to the throne? Or was it simply because this relationship became frosty, as happens to many relationships? Well, the writer doesn't explore these things, but I just feel this undercurrent of all the things that are left unsaid. And considering the drama of the gospel reading, I see parallels between the Herod Antipas John encounters and the Pontius Pilate Jesus encounters. Now, I suspect that the actual history of these situations were probably different from their portrayals here in the stories. I suspect that Pilate and Herod were likely quite willing to rid themselves of these, their nemeses, and the challenges that they represented to the political powers that they represented. But still, it's a heck of a story with a lot of drama. And who am I drawn to? I'm drawn to the daughter of Herodias. Now, as many of you may know, the portrayal of this character in the history of Western art is a fascinating one, especially if you've seen the opera Salome by Richard Strauss, and you've had a chance to witness the Dance of the Seven Veils. But in this text, the daughter is referred to in Greek by the word korasion. And you think, well, what does that mean? Well, it's the same word used to describe the 12-year-old girl whom Jesus brought back to life earlier in the gospel. Remember the words Talitha cum? And I ask, how fair has it been in the history of Western art for painters and dramatists and choreographers to portray this girl, as she has been portrayed in many ways, as the epitome of female lust? How much desire did this girl have of her own? And how much was she a pawn in the psychological games of adults? Like the second book of Samuel, the text of Mark's gospel doesn't really take the time to address this. But I'm left pondering the things that have been left unsaid. In these go-rounds with these stories this time around, I wonder about those things which aren't explicitly stated in the texts. What's going on underneath these surface events? What are the emotions and the thoughts churning under the surface in the minds and the hearts of the characters? And how are all these unsaid things going to work themselves out in the future? Well, these ideas from the readings today are the guides by which I'm using to help myself write the new chapter in my faith book. You didn't think I would leave that past sermon without a reference to it. And this chapter might be called The Return. After almost a quarter century away from my home and native land, and having been a done, that is, someone who was done with organized religion for 17 of those 24 and a half years, I returned to Canada, to my original spiritual home, the United Church of Canada. I returned to small town Ontario, north of that bustling cluster of cities around the shores of Lake Ontario known as the Golden Horseshoe. But just as you can never really go home again, I'm not going back. I know I'm not going back to the same place that I was in previously 28 years ago, neither physically nor in terms of the situation in life that's there. As you may be familiar with, as you may know, my home nation is now dealing with specters of the past. And I'm talking about the unmarked graves which have been discovered in the sites of formal residential schools. We who are descendants of European settlers in what we now call Canada are being forcefully reminded of how much more work needs to be done to be truly reconciled with the First Nations, the Inuit, and the Métis Nation. And this process is getting uncomfortable. I'm still 5,000 miles away from it, but I feel the discomfort of it because we are now being forced to come to terms with the whole idea of the residential school and the core goal behind it, which was, and this phrase was actually used, killing the Indian to save the human. This is part and parcel of Canada's founding narrative, and it goes all the way back to Sir John A. Macdonald, our first Prime Minister and the first father of Confederation. Now, it's been difficult enough for the United Church of Canada to admit and to own the fact that it and its founding denominations ran some of those residential schools. We now have to digest that one of the architects of that system was Egerton Ryerson, Methodist minister, the person after which the Ryerson Press was named, one of the great printing presses, publishing houses of Canada throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, and an advocate for free public education in Ontario, what is now Ontario. And yes, the United Church of Canada was the first denomination to offer an apology to Indigenous peoples for disregarding Native culture and spirituality. And the congregations and councils of the church are now expected to begin their meetings and their services by acknowledging the lands on which our congregations live, work, and worship, and to acknowledge the fact that these are the unceded lands of Indigenous peoples. But I think that's the easy part. I think there's much harder work that lies ahead. And complicating this is the fact that many Indigenous people aren't holding back anymore. They're not afraid anymore to say the things that were left unsaid, or perhaps more accurately, the things that weren't listened to. And some people are saying these things with force. Again, if you've heard any of the news from Canada, there have been churches in the last few weeks which have been burnt to the ground and splattered with paint and with handprints. Statues have been toppled. A couple have been symbolically decapitated. Some Indigenous leaders are forcefully talking about the reclamation of Turtle Island. That's the name that some First Nations have used to refer to the entire North American continent. Others talk about resisting the illegal occupation of Indigenous lands by settler communities. Now, the last time I recollect this type of language being used in Canadian history, a group of self-styled liberationists in 1960s Quebec decided that more direct action was necessary. They started collecting what they called involuntary taxes by robbing banks and armored trucks. They planted bombs in federal government buildings and blew up Canada Post mailboxes. They ended up kidnapping 2 men, one of whom, a minister in the Quebec government, they killed. This resulted in the suspension of civil liberties and in armed troops patrolling major Canadian cities. Now, there are those who would say I'm being unnecessarily alarmist, but I remember the echoes of the October crisis. I didn't live through them, or technically I lived through them, but I was only 5 years old at the time. But I remember the echoes of that time. And frankly, I'm not one to say that it couldn't happen again. And so you're going to ask me, well, where's the good news in all this? What's the way forward? I don't know. And I don't think it's going to be easy. For myself, I'll need to remember that whenever I'm meeting with any representatives of minority groups, be it Indigenous, Black, persons of color, I'll need to remember that the good Lord gave me 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And my experience in working and ministering with and to members of sexual minorities communities, I think has served me well in that stead. And if there is a message of good news worth proclaiming here, I would say I have found it among you. And I'm talking about my experience of observing this community's process of transitioning to a community which primarily worships and governs itself online. As I see it, South Yarra Community Baptist Church took an intentionally slow, methodical process to make this decision, one which involved several occasions for listening, just for listening, as people offered their reflections, their opinions, their concerns, their worries. People were allowed and were even encouraged to try out different modes of meeting to see how things worked. People were encouraged to try things on, and no permission had to be granted for that. Everyone understood that things had to be tried out, and as I said, tried on to see how they fit. And when it came to the time to vote, people were allowed to share whatever they shared as they voted. So that even though this motion to transition to an online form or hybrid form of worship and governments was carried unanimously, there was room for a comment like, I wish it didn't have to be this way. Even at the final stage, room was made for those to express their grief over a good thing lost. There was no expectation for people to put up and shut up or to just get over it and move on. So perhaps this is what I'm going to take away with me from my time as I've called myself, a religious refugee in this community. I've been willingly and lovingly been taken in by you, with little being asked of me, but so much being offered in return. I've seen an example of how ongoing issues in a faith community, including ones that could cause conflict and division, are to be dealt with slowly, intentionally, with an aim to listen intensely, allowing all those present to speak their truth in love and humility, to hold different points of view and different models of being and doing together in creative tension if needed, but more often as a way of seeing how things work and finding a way to move forward together, and ensuring that as few things as possible are left unsaid. I receive this gift that you've given me with much gratitude and thanks. And I will do my best to take this gift and use it as wisely as possible in the next chapter of my ongoing faith book.